Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. Today we have on Andrew Scull. He's an award-winning author, sociologist, historian of psychiatry, and distinguished professor of sociology and science studies. He taught at the University of Pennsylvania and Princeton before going to the University of California in San Diego. And he won the Roy Porter Medal for lifetime contribution to the history of medicine and the Eric Carlson Award for lifetime contributions to the history of psychiatry. His books include Museums of Madness, Decarceration, Madhouses, Mad Doctors and Madmen, Social Order, Mental Disorder, and many more. His latest book, Desperate Remedies, tells the story of psychiatry in the United States from the 19th century asylum to 21st century psychopharmacology. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. And then to start with the passage from Andrew's book, Andrew wrote, to the extent that one can derive useful conclusions from recent work on the genetics of mental illness, two seem to stand out. What we have learned strongly supports the adaptation of a dimensional rather than categorical view of psychiatric disturbances, and its findings demonstrate that psychotic patients are not genetically different in kind from the rest of us. The latter point is a sharply corrective, indeed a reversal, of the conclusion that many drew from the research of early 20th century psychiatric genetics that the mentally ill were biological degenerates. Those studies from a century ago heightened the stigma attached to mental illness. Perhaps the recognition that the sane are not fundamentally different from those suffering from serious forms of mental disturbance will have the opposite effect, though I can't say I'm sanguine that this will be the case. So first of all, I love that. That is, to me, literally the most important, I think, aspect of your book and the most important paragraph of your book. So I found myself thinking, so because I'm a mental health clinician and I only deal with psychotherapy. I mean, even though I have some peripheral kind of, let's say, sort of dealings with medication as in terms of the way I deal with psychiatrists, nurse practitioners. But for the most part, I'm doing therapy. I don't really have much to do with the medication side of things. So for me, what was so interesting about that is that I found myself wondering, like, in terms of what I learned about the sort of the neuroscience behind it and the biochemistry behind it, I always kind of find myself wondering, and in reading this particular passage, I found myself wondering, like, how does that even apply to the sort of day-to-day of psychotherapy? Like, so we know this stuff, right? So clinically, we understand that there's some genetic basis for mental disturbance and that there's a sort of a brain chemical aspect of it, which is obviously really important. But I really wonder, in terms of the foundations of all of it, how important is it really? Because when patients come to you, they don't really want to know about brain chemistry, and it doesn't really help them in the day-to-day. They're like, no, I'm having these specific problems. I'm having problems with my landlord. I'm having problems with my spouse. I find it difficult to pay the bills, whatever it is, right? And then so, to begin with the question for you, Andrew, is how did we get to this point where essentially we go from, okay, here are these, what Thomas Oz calls problems in living, but they can be solved chemically and biochemically, which seems kind of antithetical to the day-to-day world and the day-to-day problems that people experience.
Yeah, well, that's a very complicated set of issues to try to unpack. But if I could comment briefly, I think for substantial parts of the history of psychiatry, there have been very sharp distinctions drawn between the mentally ill and the rest of us. There are other periods where there's more recognition of the fact that we exist along a psychological and psychiatric continuum, as it were. And many of us at some point in our lives experience mental troubles, some of them fairly minor, some of them more serious, and others of them completely disabling. So the tendency in the last 40 or 50 years has been to move from an era where psychoanalysis was dominant and the sense was that mental illness was rooted in psychological disturbance to one that really emphasizes the brain in various ways. That may be a matter of genetics, or it may be a matter of neuroscience, particularly as we discovered the role of neurotransmitters in the brain. We used to think the brain primarily ran on electrical lines, and now we're much more interested in the kind of chemical soup, as it were. We've really moved, as Leon Eisenberg put it, from a brainless psychiatry, one that ignored the kind of physical substrate, to a mindless psychiatry, one that tends to overlook the fact that mental illness has so many social and psychological dimensions to it, and so much of what happens implicates one's social relationships and social setting. So I think both of those extremes are clearly a mistake. To emphasize only the psychological and the social clearly takes us in unfortunate directions, because it neglects some part of the picture. But you know, you spoke in the question about that biochemistry and genetics must play some role. The research, I mean, one of the things one's thinking about looking at research on mental illness is we want fundamentally to understand where it comes from. And we've not made an enormous amount of progress, I venture to say, on that. Not that we've made none, but if you ask honestly, what's the cause of schizophrenia? What's the cause of major depression? What's the cause of bipolar disorder? The honest answer is we do not know. We have some clues. They don't take us very far. Another dimension of research on mental illness and another dimension of coping with it is to try to come up with strategies that in the here and now, given our rather limited understanding of the underlying problems, actually affect people's lives for the better. And that may be a mix of medication and psychotherapy of various sorts since World War II, really since the 70s, when psychoanalysis largely went into eclipse. That's meant much more things like cognitive behavioral therapy developed from within psychology rather than psychoanalysis, which is much more time limited and focuses on the actual symptoms, as I don't need to tell you, trying to cope with what it is people come to you complaining about. Right. And for certain kinds of mental troubles, that sort of intervention seems to have some positive effects. For others, its efficacy, like the efficacy of the medications we have, is much more limited. And the problem with the medicines we have, well, there are multiple problems here. They're not psychiatric penicillin. They don't cure. What they do at best is provide some symptomatic relief, whether you're talking about mania, people getting really, really out of it, or depression or schizophrenia, assuming those labels mark real diseases, but they certainly represent points on a continuum. They're things that afflict people. The medications for all those things help some with relatively few side effects, and they're the very lucky ones, and they are a minority. They help some people at the cost of pretty serious side effects. If we're talking about modern day antipsychotics, still some problems with things like tardive dyskinesia, a disorder that produces involuntary movements and facial grimacing and so on, that people often interpret ironically as signs that somebody's mentally unwell. And sometimes Parkinson's-like symptoms, or
we just experienced some
massive weight gain. They, you know, people put on 30, 40, 50, 60 pounds. They develop metabolic disorders, heart disorders, diabetes. So the choice of the drug becomes very complex. And then there are another group of patients for whom these things simply don't work. All they get are the negative effects. And sadly, because obviously one hopes that medication will have positive effects on people, the drug companies have been largely moving away from investing in this field. So we're stuck with a set of drugs that really haven't improved since they first came on the scene in the 1950s and have real drawbacks. Let me cite one study that I think demonstrates what I'm talking about, because when a sociologist speaks to you about the efficacy of medications, the tendency is, yeah, what do you know?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a very famous study that appeared in 2005 in the New England Journal of Medicine. It's called the Katie study. And what it did was compare 3 modern antipsychotic drugs with one developed in the 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
And the question was, do the new ones work better? And the answer is no, they don't.
Wow.
They're largely a marketing exercise that made a lot of money for drug companies. But the other interesting thing about this study was that there were 4 drugs in the study, and for once it wasn't funded by the pharmaceutical industry, it's funded by NIMH, and between 67 and 82% of the people taking each of the drugs dropped out of the trial. And they dropped out either because the drugs didn't work for them or because they found the side effects intolerable. So that gives you some measure of how limited the drug treatments we have available to us are. Stephen Hyman, who was the head of NIMH in the late 90s, early 2000s, spoke about the antidepressants, and he said, these are really rather mediocre drugs. And he's right, that when you look at the research, they consistently seem to be a bit more effective than placebo, but only a little bit more effective than placebo. So over time, there's a small difference. It's not even clear that for many people it's clinically significant. There's a big difference that people often misunderstand. And when drugs are advertised to the general population, the ads always say this, it makes this is significantly better treatment for you. What that means very often is it's statistically better than the alternative, but the additional benefit it brings you is often so small as to not really be of great significance. So this is
Andrew,
Andrew,
and just for our audience, right? Can we distinguish what's the difference between clinical significance and statistical significance? Because usually when people hear the word significant, they automatically think like, well, if it's a significant difference, that means it really does matter.
Yes, of course. So typically, one of the things that has emerged in medicine in the last 75 years is what's called an emphasis on evidence-based medicine. That depends on running clinical trials in which some patients get the active treatment, whatever it might be. It might even be psychotherapy, and some patients don't. And what you try to do is allocate people randomly between the two things, the treatment, the non-treatment, and you try to make sure they don't know what they're getting. That's almost impossible, of course, with psychotherapy. It's very, very difficult. But with drug treatments, it's possible to give people a sugar pill or the real thing. Or if you're a bit cleverer than that, if you know, for example, that antidepressants cause certain obvious side effects, dry mouth, other kinds of immediate symptoms, you give them a substitute that doesn't have a psychoactive effect, but mimics those side effects, so they can't guess so easily which are on their own. So statistical significance means when you compare those two groups, you look for differences in outcomes, and you try to determine whether those could possibly happen by chance. If they exceed a certain limit, it's increasingly unlikely that you're just seeing noise, you're just seeing a fake reaction. So statistically, something may be, you get a reliable effect. And that's what, for example, when you look at antidepressants compared to placebo, almost always there's a difference statistically between the people getting the drug and the people who are not. But you're looking for degrees of improvement. So typically, when you're dealing with something like depression, you have a measuring scale, like the Hamilton scale, for example, that measures according to a series of questions or a series of observations, to what degree your symptoms have changed. Are you less prone to be sleepless? Is your appetite better? Is your mood better? Are your, and so on. So clinically, small movements on that scale don't make much difference to people's actual outcome, to whether we would regard them as having an improved life, an improved mental state. So you could have something that statistically is better than placebo, than giving people a sugar pill. But in reality, those differences aren't enough to really make a difference. And when you load in the fact that drugs are not a free lunch, whenever you take even an aspirin, that you run some risk of untoward effects accompanying taking that pill. And in the case of antipsychotics and antidepressants and mood disorder drugs like lithium, those risks are non-trivial. In fact, sometimes they're life-threatening, certainly life-altering. So it's very important to understand. Significant to most people means, oh, it's important. But actually, if it's just statistically significant, it may be relatively unimportant in the real world.
Right. And I'm curious, what role do drug companies play in perpetuating the chemical imbalance theory?
Well, there have been some interesting recent studies that have attracted quite a lot of attention by a psychiatrist in London named Joanna Moncrief, who's produced 2 papers, one of which looks at the chemical imbalance theory, the idea that depression is caused by a shortage of serotonin in the brain, with serotonin being one of the neurotransmitters that we all is part of our makeup. And she produced a second study, which will appear in print as late as December of this year, but is circulating online already. We looked at whether it was just drug company marketing that spread the idea that you just needed enough serotonin and you'd be happy again, or whether psychiatrists as well contributed to the spread of that theory. And that paper, to my mind, looking at both the scientific literature and the textbooks that are taught to psychiatrists, shows that the profession themselves had some role in perpetuating this theory. It wasn't just the drug companies. And it wasn't, this is something that had a very receptive audience. Tipper Gore, Al Gore's first wife, like a number of politicians' wives, suffered from depression. I think being the spouse of a politician is not a very pleasant experience for most people. She was depressed. She got treated, and in her autobiography, which was ghosted, she talks about it, and she says, well, it's like running out of gas in your car. You come to a juddering halt. If you don't have enough serotonin, you become not just unhappy, but seriously depressed. And then you get this drug, this SSRI, and it replenishes your serotonin levels in your brain, and then you're happy. Scientifically, that's simply not true. It's been known for 15, 20 years that there are serious flaws with that argument. Let me give you a couple of reasons why it's not so, apart from the fact that we have a very hard time measuring serotonin levels in the brain. When you take SSRIs, you get your serotonin levels improve almost right away. That's what the drugs do. But typically it takes weeks before those drugs take effect, if they do. There are other antidepressants that work well by a completely different pathway. So people whose serotonin levels are not being affected, nonetheless show some degree of improvement, limited as it may be, on those pills. So we've moved, informed opinion. Very few neuroscientists now would propose that sort of simplistic account of where depression comes from. But it has been a very powerful marketing tool. And it's something that for patients and patients' families, I think was quite appealing when it came on the scene, in the following sense that much mental illness in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s was attributed to, as bad parenting. You had a refrigerator mother or a schizophrenia-inducing mother. Families tended to be blind. Mental disease as well, sadly, has always been accompanied by a great deal of stigma, and many times people being reluctant to recognize the reality of the suffering that it causes. If you start to tell people, hey, you've got something biologically wrong with your brain, or your son or your daughter's behavior is the product of that, not your bad parenting, obviously that's an attractive thing. And it makes mental illness real. It makes it clear that it is an illness, not malingering or something else, not made up, not just a problem in living, to use Tom Saz's term. So it has attractions in that way for people. There are drawbacks, I think, or at least that it's not really a true account, because we still find the origins of mental illness so mysterious, but also it tends to reduce people's agency. I mean, if it's something in the chemical soup of my brain that's making me the way I am, there's not a hell of a lot I can do about that. I mean, other than take pills that might correct it. But actually, I mean, if you're somebody who dispenses psychotherapy, for example, one of the things you're trying to teach people about the way they think about the world is that the patterns that they adopt, the ways they typically respond, are actually self-defeating and damaging. And they can learn perhaps to deal with the world in a different and more realistic way. So you want people to have that sense of agency if that sort of intervention is going to work. If you diminish that sense of possibility, I think it can actually be anti-therapeutic. So, this is an area where if you look at the research on drugs, I think the big drug companies have moved away from further work in this area, even though they made billions and billions of dollars of profit in this sector, because they literally ran out of new ideas, new targets. They couldn't figure out anything that was likely to work better. They suffered a lot of reputational damage because there were lawsuits that exposed all sorts of chicanery that they got up to with these drugs. So they controlled the data increasingly. Clinical trials are very expensive business. These days, in order to generate statistical significance, the larger the sample you have, the more likely you're going to be able to generate some statistically different significant findings. So you have these very large trials, often spanning different countries. The only person who sees, the only group that sees all the data is the drug company, for whom those are proprietarial things. They own the data. Right. And the lawsuits have shown that they suppress data they don't like. They manipulate findings to emphasize the ones that favor their drugs, and they often hide the ones about side effects, for example, that would damage the drug's marketability. And they've had to pay damages that range in the $2-3 billion range. It's been a cost of business that's been worth doing so long as the drugs were as profitable as they were. But I think other areas of medicine show more promise of profitability. And as I say, until we have a better clue about the underlying mechanisms that produce mental illness, presuming those are purely physical, which I doubt, then you know, the incentives, and in the last 10 years, all the drug companies you can think of, Squibb, Pfizer, the lot, have really abandoned this area of research. To the extent research continues, it tends to be small startups with an idea that maybe will help.
Right. And what I think is so interesting is that you have multiple chemicals involved in something like, let's say, depression. So you'll have dopamine, neuroepinephrine, and then also serotonin. And then so the question is, okay, so right. So how do you kind of just disentangle which ones are the ones that are, I guess, mostly connected to it, as opposed to which environmental factors? And then how do you kind of separate all of them and figure out what to kind of treat, you know?
Yes, no, enormously difficult. And a further problem with the drugs, I spoke earlier that, you know, there are some people for whom, fortunately, these things work reasonably well and they tolerate the drugs reasonably well. And then there's this group in the middle where the cross benefit's tricky, and then there's another group for whom the drugs are just a curse. Going into treatment, we don't know which group a given patient's going to fall into. Right. And when a particular drug doesn't work, what tends to happen is they prescribed another one and then another one, or sometimes multiple drugs. Sometimes they get antidepressants and antipsychotics, multiplying the possibility they're going to end up with nasty side effects. So that's a serious problem, and it would be nice if we could say, well, genetics is going to unravel which patient's going to fall into which group in advance, and then you know you don't give this class of drug to this patient because it's not going to work. Unfortunately, we're not anywhere close to that yet. Maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. Part of the problem, I think, is you know, I spoke at the very beginning about how we've tended to lurch from biology doesn't matter to everything's biology when it comes to mental illness. I think that distinction is on its face a false one. One of the things that's interesting about us as animals, and we are animals at the end of the day, is that our brains stay so plastic for so long. So when you try to make a sharp distinction between the biological and the psychological / social, you're pretending as though those two things are independent, but they're actually very interdependent. So the way in which your brain develops structurally, the way it works, is not just a product of the brain you were born with. It's also the product of all the experiences you have, which then translate into changes in the way your brain is put together and works. The drugs too change the structure of your brain. There was a huge line of thinking in the 1980s and 90s. We saw studies that showed people with schizophrenia had brains that shrank, particularly in the frontal cortex. But it now turns out that a lot of that is the effect of the drugs we've been giving them. So we're easily led down wrong pathways here. And what we really need to understand, I think, and it's why mental illness is such a complicated problem, is that it's foolish to pretend that the fact that we're biological beings has nothing to do with some of the problems we see with mental illness. It's also foolish to ignore the role of the social environment, the psychological experiences of the child and the adult as they grow, because the brain continues to be plastic much longer than we had thought. So, you know, we need that more comprehensive look at things just because of the way we're actually constituted and built. We don't arrive in this world with a fully formed brain that after that just dictates what's going to happen to us. And when we look, a lot of money is being poured into genetic research. What's interesting, in the early 20th century, a lot of that genetic research was associated with eugenics, the idea that, you know, there were some biologically defective inferior people. And there were a lot of family studies because that was the way you could study genes back in those days. And the leading researches were done in Germany in the 1920s and 30s. And if you know anything about your history, that's the period where the Nazis are rising and coming to power. And that strand of genetic research fed into the Nazis, first mass sterilizing the mentally ill and then murdering them. Something like 250,000 mental patients murdered with the active participation of many leading German psychiatrists. So genetic research kind of went into eclipse after World War II because of that, the association with the Nazis. But when we switch back to a more biological view of mental illness, then genetics once again started to come to the fore. And of course, then we had great breakthroughs. We had the ability to chop up bits of the genetic code. We were able early in the 21st century to decode the whole of the human genome, or the very substantial part of it. So the expectation was, because families everybody sees mental illness running in families to a degree, right, that the genetics would really provide a major key into this mystery of where mental illness came from. But in fact, it's tended to complicate the situation. Everybody expected we'd find a kind of Mendelian gene for schizophrenia, or a set of genes that made people liable to schizophrenia. That's not the way it's worked out. First of all, we now have very massive abilities to process large amounts of data. And when we feed in everything we know about the genetics of people who don't seem to be mentally ill and people who are, it takes it's an enormous number of variations in the genetic code to explain even a tiny bit of the variance. If we aggregate everything they've been able to find, you can explain 7 or perhaps 9% of the variance, not much, in other words. And it also turns out.
Wait, Andrew. So I just want to interrupt to ask, right? So when we're thinking about statistical variance, right? So what are we thinking in terms of like the contribution? How does anybody even really assess how that contribution is made? Would we say that, okay, you have some people that do have these genetic traits, and then some people who don't, and then some people have schizophrenia and some people who don't? And how do you sort of quantify that, right?
That's what you'd like. That's what you'd like if there were clear-cut differences that emerged. But the problem is, so you get a statistical association. So if you have these kinds of variations that show up, you have, statistically speaking, a slightly higher risk of developing schizophrenia. Right. Let us say. But it's only a statistical association. It doesn't really tell us a lot about cause, and it only explains a very small amount of the variance. Very many people have those same genetic patterns and don't develop schizophrenia. So there's no obvious immediate, you're thinking you're going to have a clear cause and effect. This genetic defect, you become schizophrenic. That's not what the research shows. And when it comes to the inheritance of mental disorder, it's even more complex than that, because there's great overlap in the data between people who have what we call bipolar disorder, and people we call schizophrenic, and people we say have major depression. There's not a clear pattern that distinguishes those categories when you look at the genetic research. A little bit, but mostly it's overlap. What seems to happen, to the extent genes matter, at least with the data we have so far, is in families you have a slightly greater propensity to become mentally ill, but what form that mental illness is going to take is not obviously genetically determined, if you see what I'm saying here. So it's partly for that reason, and partly because our diagnostic categories in psychiatry are derived purely symptomatically, really, that leading researchers are beginning to wonder whether these really are different diseases in the way, say, tuberculosis and pneumonia are clearly different kinds of lung disease, whether they're points on a continuum. And that, again, when you read that quote at the beginning, I talked about the difference between a categorical and dimensional view of mental illness. A dimensional view suggests we're all arrayed along a continuum. And at some point along that continuum, the differences become so acute, so noticeable, that we would begin to label them, we begin to respond to them differently. The differences are real. I want to emphasize that. And at the margins, it's really obvious when somebody is labeled a chronic schizophrenic, there are a whole series of aspects of their being that any competent member of the culture, you don't need to be a trained psychiatrist or clinical psychologist to recognize. You will recognize that something is really badly different. I mean, this person doesn't operate in the same universe as the rest of us.
Right.
But there are other people who, and this is socially variable over time. Societies tolerate certain kinds of eccentricities and difficult personalities. And in other societies, those kinds of difference become intolerable. And so where we draw the line, where we say this is pathology and this is just normal human variation, he's a cantankerous old git who's difficult to get along with, or he's something a bit more serious than that, So drawing those lines is difficult. We've created categories that really revolve around a core set of symptoms, and they're not, they don't seem to correspond to what we see as we learn more about genetics or we learn more about neuroscience, to sort of natural kinds out there in the world. So I've seen, in the course of writing this book, I talked with a number of leading psychiatrists I like to think of as friends, and we have some robust disagreements sometimes, but we also converge on some things. So I was, just recently I was in London at the launch of my book, and I spoke with Sir Robin Murray, who's a fellow of the Royal Society, and he's one of the world's leading researchers on schizophrenia. He spent 50 years in the field, and he wrote a paper recently. It was called "Mistakes I've Made in My Research Career." It's a brave thing to do. And he said, I don't think this label of schizophrenia is going to still be here in 10 years. I think it's going to vanish. Wow. And people have said the same thing about bipolar disorder. So that's a potentially quite destabilizing thing. Schizophrenia was first labeled as that around 1910 by the Swiss psychiatrist Bleuler, really modifying the earlier notion of dementia praecox, which had been a German invention. And we've been taught for 100 years and more that schizophrenia is real. It's a disease like pneumonia or TB or
which is also very cultural, because if we're thinking about sort of what they call more primitive societies, you have like shamans and sort of these seers who are, I guess in some sense they would be classified as schizophrenic probably in our kind of culture, but the thing is, like, the way that they adapt to the culture is so different than the way that we have adapted people or have allowed people to adapt who are considered to be mentally ill, where those people are in some ways placed on a pedestal, whereas here they're denigrated.
Very quick.
I'm sorry. But there are, it's true, when you look at history, look culturally, sometimes certain kinds of mentally ill people are seen in that positive fashion. You could see that even in medieval times when we look back at some of the people, for example, who were made saints, and you look at what went on, you think that's somebody who was seriously disturbed. Or if you read the Hebrew Bible and you read about some of the prophets, you go, well, in our society, people who heard God speaking to them and did this and did that would be labeled as out of their minds. There they had but for most of human history, most people who were seriously mentally ill, that was not a status you particularly wanted. But you're right, it does vary culturally, and sometimes these things come to be valued, or in the alternative, seen as people who are possessed by the devil, right, with very nasty consequences for them. So yeah, it's an example of how complex this whole problem of mental illness is, that it accrues all these layers of meaning and these different social responses that vary to some extent by social class, by belief structures, by time, by where you are. So it does represent an enormous puzzle, and it's, I think, precisely because our understandings of it are so thin, and the disturbance that these people sometimes create in our midst are so great that we often reject them. We construct these stigmatizing views of what's the matter with them, and we often treat them. So when I called my book Desperate Remedies, I was trying to invoke actually a rather complicated set of things. One set of people who are quite desperate, some of them are the mentally ill. Some people actually, in the course of their manic phase, for example, actually kind of enjoy that state. Right. The people around them don't. The second group who are desperate are families and the near and dear of these people, for whom dealing with the consequences of their mental states is, shall I put it, more than slightly stressful. If you're living with a schizophrenic daughter who is threatening to kill herself, that does make daily life, or maybe kill you, and make daily life rather complicated. So they're desperate. And then psychiatrists and psychologists who are making a career of trying to treat these people are desperate as well. They want their own sense of efficacy. They want, they're professionals that become healers. At least that's what they hope to be.
But also, unfortunately, oftentimes they're not willing to work with the patient. Like, so Alan, were you going to talk about Dan Bergner, who we had on?
Yes. So when we were talking about schizophrenia, we had a guest on, Daniel Bergner, and in his book, he interviewed a woman who had schizophrenia. And what was very fascinating about her is that she actually developed sort of a different relationship to that label of schizophrenia. And in fact, she would actually engage with the voices in her head and somewhat become friendly with them. And it sort of painted a different picture of maybe how to sort of treat or deal with schizophrenia, as opposed to label it as an issue. Maybe it's something that could be treated, or one could change their relationship to it, potentially.
Right, as opposed to like medical suppression, which is what she was really against. There's an article on her in the New York Times specifically about her. Dan wrote it too. Yeah, so Dan wrote it as well, right? And so she said, essentially, she said the problems that she had with psychiatrists was, she's like, first of all, the drugs were awful. They made her feel terrible. But then on top of that, she's like, they were just trying to suppress the voices, and it didn't even really work. Whereas like this other way that she's found around it, it's not, so it's not necessarily a victory per se from what I remember about it, because she said, look, the voices still come up, they still get angry and aggressive, especially when I'm stressed out. But the thing is, she said, it's in sort of, when we're comparing and contrasting the costs and benefits, she preferred her method to the medication, which she said for her, again, if you're factoring in the side effects too, she said they were just a nightmare.
Well, there are, patient self-help groups, and there are groups of people working with patients who've tried those kinds of approaches, and for some patients, they may work. With all of these approaches, at the end of the day, we're a bit fumbling in the dark. And yes, when you stigmatize the mentally ill, when you treat them as radically different from us, almost subhuman, if you look at some of the language, then you stop listening to them. And one of the major themes of Desperate Remedies is how vulnerable mental patients have been to therapeutic enthusiasts, people who get the idea that they know the solution to mental illness. We'll zap them with electricity. We will put them into comas with insulin. We'll remove the infected parts of their bodies that are poisoning their brain. So we'll pull all their teeth and their tonsils and then their colons and their stomachs, or we'll sever part of their frontal lobes because they're obsessed with a certain set of ideas. We'll interrupt that by physically damaging that portion of the brain. When you see the litany of those kinds of interventions, you understand the way in which desperation and the compulsion to do something even when you don't know really what you should be doing can lead you down some very dangerous pathways.
Right. And by the way, my grandfather actually died from that. So he was taken to an asylum. Yeah, so in the Soviet Union, he was taken to an insane asylum. And then so I think they diagnosed him with schizophrenia, even though from my family history, it doesn't seem like he had it from what my mom tells me, but that's what the diagnosis was. And then so essentially they gave him insulin and he passed away from it. So that was it. They just sort of drugged him to death.
Yeah. Insulin coma therapy. I mean, it was widespread, but it could never be used on a mass scale because when you're put into those comas, it's medically, I mean, apart from the suffering that it causes, it's very dangerous. I mean, you're hovering literally on the brink between life and death. If they don't administer glucose soon enough, or if the dose is a bit too large, you'll lapse into a permanent coma and you'll die.
Right.
So, the interesting thing is that how easily that was accepted as a treatment and how uncritically psychiatrists in the late 1930s were given statistics that it cured 80% of schizophrenics, one wishes. And then when it was finally put to a controlled test in the 1950s, it just didn't work. But remember, for 2,000 years, we treated lots of illness with bloodletting and purges and vomits and blisters. The doctors truly believed they worked, and so did the patients, and probably because of the placebo effect, they did have some impact. When we look back at it, we shake our heads. But I think people will look back at some of the things we do and shake their heads. As we already do with things like insulin comas and lobotomies. We look at that and we think, oh, that's the pre-scientific age. But I worry. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so and just thinking about it, you have like this entire history of just, let's call it motivated reasoning, where essentially these sort of academics, researchers, what have you, they're doing things that are sort of harmful to the mass public, let's say in large, right? Not for everybody, obviously, but they have like an inordinate amount of power. But then as we kind of move on, what you're seeing is that you're saying that, like, let's say governments and well, in this particular case, like the FDA allows like direct to consumer marketing, which doesn't even make sense, because if now we're thinking about these people who are at least experts, they have power. Now we're kind of shifting the power to consumers who, like, I'm not a researcher, right? Alan's not a researcher. I mean, this isn't what we do for a living, but yet now somehow we can go to our doctor and we could say, hey doc, I saw this great commercial. That's what I want to treat me.
Yeah. And believe me, those very expensive ad campaigns aren't being done because they don't work. They're done because demonstrably they drive sales. Right. And yes, we're one of the few societies, along with, I think it's New Zealand, that allows this kind of direct advertising to consumers. And of course, it's not confined to the realm of psychiatry. It's quite widespread, but it's a disaster. In my view, it's bad enough that clinicians, once they're trained and let loose on the world, there's relatively limited kind of continuing education of them. So, and it's impossible to keep on top of these things. You look at the literature. I mean, I had to read realms and realms of this stuff, and even I was reading a small fraction of what was out there. I tried to focus my attention. But if you're a busy clinician, you know, working a 40 or 50-hour week, where are you going to fit in the time to stay on top of that? For an ordinary person, they hear this makes a significant difference to your life. And that's back to when we were talking about clinical versus statistical significance. The data very often don't support that, but it's, you know, again, how are ordinary people supposed to figure that out? Right. You know, one of the fascinating things I spoke about these recent studies of the kind of chemical imbalance theory of depression. The lead researcher there also was the co-author of one of the papers that critiqued the literature on clinical trials of antidepressants, where you're comparing antidepressants and placebos, and made the point that although the differences already are fairly slight, and yet the trials very often aren't blind at all, because people are able to guess almost right away, I'm on the right pill or I'm on the sugar pill.
Right.
And if they think they're getting the active treatment and they believe, you know, their doctors, you know, they think, oh, this is going to work, that magnifies the placebo effect. So you're not getting a real measure of what the drug is or is not doing. So it's a very complicated area. And I think a lot of the research, it's hard to argue against basic research on the underlying problems here. But when all the research is running down a particular narrow pathway, it's, I think, not surprising that it doesn't produce good results. When Thomas Insel stepped down as head of NIMH back in 2015, he gave a what ought to be well, it was in an obscure place, an MIT electronic journal, but he recently repeated it in his book, Healing. And he said, you know, I was the head of the agency for about 13 years, and I spent a lot of money, and I funded all this cool research on genetics and neuroscience. And he said, I think I spent upwards of $20 billion. Wow. And he said, the state of people with serious mental illness didn't improve a bit after spending all that money. My reaction to that was, that's a pretty appalling. I think it's true, but I think it's a pretty appalling admission, and maybe something that should suggest you should change tactics a little bit. Perhaps, I mean, yes, we want to understand underlying mechanisms, but shouldn't we also be investigating what kinds of interventions in the here and now, given the limitations of our knowledge, produced improved outcomes for people's lives? You know, should we be spending more money on kind of clinical research as alongside the basic science stuff? So it's, yeah, I worry that we've gone down some overly simplistic pathways. They produce some knowledge. I mean, Insel went on to say it's produced some really cool science, and it's you know, it's funded some really interesting work. But at the end of the day, if you're the head of NIMH, you're one of your major charges is improving the condition of the mentally ill. We know now that if you have serious mental illness, you are going to live 15 to 25 years less than the rest of us. And that gap is growing, not diminishing. That's not just the product of bad psychiatry. That's the product of poor social policies, which condemn people to the street and the jail when they have mental illness. But it's a very sobering statistic, and it tells us how far away we are from really dealing adequately with this problem. Once upon a time, we put people into these big asylums and basically tossed the key away. But now we're back to this kind of revolving thing where they go from the flop house to the street to the jail. You know, the three largest places of inpatient care, if you can call it that, for the mentally ill in the US, LA County Jail, Cook County Jail in Illinois, and Rikers Island. That's an indictment of us as a society that we would do that to people with serious mental illness. It's shocking. That's all I can say.
Absolutely. And I sort of have two questions in one. Of course, I want to respect your time, so I guess I'll ask both. So what's your take on something like psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy? And then and what do you think is the future of psychiatry?
Great questions.
In 30 seconds, yeah. Well, you know, there was some preliminary experimentation with LSD before it became a kind of party drug and then became illegal back in the 50s and early 60s. I think that the data on this and on ketamine and esketamine is very, very weak at the moment. Whether these will prove to be another series of desperate remedies or prove to be something that actually has some purchase, I don't know. It's not surprising, for example, that if you take Special K, which people have taken as a party drug to improve their mood and to have a good time, that temporarily your mental state changes. I mean, those drugs have powerful effects. What we need to know is not in a 30-day trial with very few participants run by somebody who believes in the treatment, which is what we get at the moment. We need something where you look at things over the long haul. We don't even have those studies with antipsychotics and antidepressants. Typical trials don't run for years, and yet people are on those drugs for years. And so I'm just very cautious. One of the themes of my book is don't buy into enthusiasms too easily, that people often sincerely believe in whatever nostrum they're peddling, and then only later do we say, no, that's completely wrong. Henry Cotton was a guy who believed everybody went mad because their brains were being poisoned by toxins that came from infections elsewhere in their body and floated to the brain, right? So he pulled his two children's teeth and his wife's teeth so they wouldn't go mad. His two children later both committed suicide, so that didn't work so well. When Henry himself had a breakdown, he went off to Hot Springs, Arkansas, and he had his teeth pulled. So he believed in what he was doing. He was perfectly sincere, and he was sincerely nuts, right? I mean, the treatment maimed and killed thousands of people, and it was a disaster. So I worry. Deep brain stimulation is another thing we see touted. The two controlled trials that were started of that treatment, funded by the makers of the devices, both ended early because the trials were a disaster. And yet it still continues. The American Journal of Psychiatry just 2 years ago published a piece by one of the enthusiasts from this treatment suggesting it would work. I see stories in the Washington Post saying maybe deep brain stimulation is the cure for our opioid epidemic. And I just want to hold my head in my hands. 7 hours of neurosurgery to cure all those addicts. It's not going to work, but we grasp for these simple solutions. Now, psychiatry, well, if one's optimistic, what you hope to see, and you do see with, I think, some of the young people moving into the profession, what you hope to see is a broadening of the approach, a willingness to consider multiple things. But it's very hard, for example, in academic psychiatry, to build a career based on social psychiatry, on attending to these social things. careers are built by having large grants to study genetics and neuroscientific things. And you won't be the darling of your medical school dean doing the other kind of research, even though in terms of practical effect on people's lives, that may be the better way to go. I think many of the younger psychiatrists coming into the field are beginning to be unhappy with what they see. Whether they'll be able to move things into a different direction, I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Yeah, and then also, I mean, before we wrap up, we just want to be clear in saying this because I think it's really important that please do not stop taking your medication if you're on medication for depression, schizophrenia, whatever. Please, that's a disclaimer.
Absolutely.
Because these are sort of
two things. Do not turn to me for clinical advice. I get emails all the time now because of the book saying, I have such and such a problem. What do you advise I do? And I say, go and see. If I know a good psychiatrist in the neighborhood, go and see Dr. X. But yes, absolutely. That's very, very, very important. Once you're on these medications, getting off them can be quite tricky, but abruptly discontinuing them can be quite dangerous. So absolutely do not take this as skepticism about
right. And then also it's also worth saying, because these medications do help some people significantly, even if let's say there are no sharp withdrawal symptoms, I mean, you're going to pretty much decline back into your old symptoms, into symptomology. So please,
we know that happens with patients where medication does work pretty well. Right. They then feel better and they discontinue.
Yeah, they just stop taking them.
Bang, it comes back.
Right.
So yeah, the first thing is, do not take medical advice from me, because I am not trained to give it to you. And besides, global medical advice over the radio is a bad idea. But secondly, we do know that abrupt discontinuation is potentially extremely harmful. So if you're considering getting off your medication, you need to do that very carefully and under careful medical care.
Absolutely.
Don't self-medicate.
Yeah. Andrew, thank you so much
Yeah.
for coming on. This was such an insightful episode.
Thank you so much. Yeah. And if we wanted to,
I really appreciate you having me. You'll let me know when it, with a link when it
absolutely
materializes in the world. Yes. Okay.
Of course. And
that's
if
great.
we wanted
Very nice to meet both of you virtually. And thanks for the conversation.
Wait, Andrew, one last thing.
Yes. If we wanted to follow your work and of course buy the book, where can we do that?
Oh, the book is most easily bought from Amazon, and you can buy it in two very different forms. You can buy it as a you can buy it as a physical book, and it's running at a discount right now on Amazon, which is nice. Or you can also get an audiobook. And I had a bit of a role in choosing who did that reading. Penguin Random House published the book over in Britain. And they sent me a half dozen possibilities. They said, listen to these and decide who you would like reading your book. And I picked one of them, whose name is Patrick, and I forget his last name, which is a bit shameful. But the audiobook is really very engaging. It turns out he is wonderful at reading my prose. And if you like audiobooks, my wife has taken to listening to this when she takes long walks. So that's a good way to do it. And I think it's also available on Kindle if you're one of those people who likes reading books on screens. I'm not one of those.
And also, you're not on social media. So what's your website?
I sadly don't have one.
Oh, interesting. I thought you did.
No, you can contact Harvard University Press, who published the book here, and they have a website that has things. And there are a number of podcasts out there besides yours, if people are interested in there. And a long interview I did with the Los Angeles Times that's available out there online. And I think if people want to get a quick sense of the book, that helps quite a bit.
Excellent. So. All right, Andrew. Thank you again.
Okay. Thank you again.
Well, thank you guys. Have a good rest of your Sunday, and good luck with the broadcast. Okay.
You too. Talk to you soon.
Take care.
Right. Bye-bye.
All right. Awesome. So everyone, if you want to follow us, please follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, even TikTok. We're also on Twitter at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe,
hit the bell on YouTube.
That's right. And everyone, thank you again so much for watching, and see you next time.